The French Revolution began in 1789 and ended in 1791. This war was fought by the Third Estate, the lowest of the social class in 18th century France, for the right to be heard, especially considering the fact that they made up the majority of the population. It started out fairly peaceful as revolutions go, but as the stakes were raised to get it right to create a fair and representative government, violence broke out. People only remember the French Revolution for the blood that was spilled and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, but it was so much more than that. The revolution was a call for liberty and equality by the people, for the people. The American Revolution began in 1775, fighting against British rule for its colonies in North America. The colonists were tired of the tyrannical government and their lack of representation in the British Parliament, inspired by the thinkers of the Enlightenment. France helped the colonists fund this war in order to help weaken its traditional adversary, and so great sums of money and a great many men were sent across the Atlantic to fight. In return for assisting in the defeat of England, France gained a lot of debt and a lot of soldiers with new ideas, including the famous Marquis de Lafayette. After being forced to use borrowed money to help fund the American Revolution, France was in a mountain of debt. King Louis XVI and his ministers were met with great opposition in the Parliament of Paris when they tried to increase taxes in order to decrease the country's deficit. At one point, half of France's annual budget was available to be used by the state, the other half was being paid to creditors. By 1787, the tensions leading up to the revolution had already begun to rise. In order to avoid the declaration of partial bankruptcy, what would have been an unpopular action of an unpopular monarch, King Louis XVI decided to call for the Estates General to vote on the issue. According to tradition, the Estates General would sit in separate houses dependent upon which estate they represented. A motion would be passed if two houses approved. Members of the Third Estate realized that this gave unproportional power to the clergy and the nobles, and so they demanded to have the Estates General sit in the same house, and that the Third Estate should have the majority. The king ruled that while the Third Estate would have increased representation due to the fact that their percentage in the population was the highest, they would still sit separately. On June 17, 1789, after a month of debate, the legislative body renamed itself the National Assembly, and on June 20th, the delegates of the Third Estate swore the oath of the tennis court. Having been moved to an indoor tennis court within Versailles due to construction, the delegates of the Third Estate swore not to leave until a new constitution was written. They, along with the other delegates of the National Assembly, were forcibly removed by the monarchy in early July. King Louis XVI had finally declared bankruptcy. The people of France were afraid what it meant when the king dismissed his finance minister after declaring bankruptcy. Already under incredible financial stress, the Third Estate worried that King Louis XVI would turn to the aristocracy for financial advice, that they would have to deal with even greater hardship. On July 14, 1789, hundreds of people marched on the Bastille, the Parisian prison that they viewed to be a symbol of the aristocracy, looking for guns and other weapons. The march was incredibly violent and inspired many peasants throughout France to rise up against their lords. This began the Great Fear, a summer of incredible violence and rebellions throughout the French countryside. On August 27, 1789, the National Assembly issued the Declarations of the Rights of Man, a document calling for liberty and equality for all French male citizens, as well as representative democracy. This document called into question the power of the monarchy. After the violent summer, many nobles had left Versailles to live outside of the country in safety, causing for the demand for luxury items and the French economy to decrease. The grain industry was especially hit hard at this time, causing for bread prices to soar. On October 5, 1789, thousands of poor women marched on Versailles, protesting the price of bread, as well as the luxurious lifestyle of the royal family, especially Queen Marie Antoinette. A year earlier, in order to combat her unfavorability with the French people, Marie Antoinette had a portrait painted of her with her children, leaving an empty crib for her daughter that had died during the painting process. This portrait was intended to gain sympathy for the queen, and perhaps show her duty to her children, for she had been criticized for a lack of involvement in their lives. Unfortunately, none of these goals were reached, and dislike for Marie intensified.
I was among the women that marched on Versailles in 1789. As it is my job to go to the market, I was completely aware of the outrageous price for a measly loaf of bread. The irony was tough to swallow, considering that bread is what my family, along with many others, relied on to feed ourselves. Other foods are too expensive for my husband's meager wages to cover, and so bread was always our frequent choice of nutrition. When the prices began to climb, my neighbors and I grew incredibly angry. We cannot buy food for our children to eat, and yet Marie Antoinette is off living a life more luxurious and excessive than most other queens can even dream about. On October 5th, 1789, my fellow women and I took a stand against the tyranny of this royal family.
The March on Versailles forced the royal family to relocate to Paris, and the National Assembly followed. In July 1790, King Louis XVI accepted the creation of a constitutional monarchy. All legislative power would remain with the newly named Legislative Assembly, while the monarch would stay the head of state. A year later, the royal family unsuccessfully tried to get out of the country. The foreign reaction to this revolution was not positive. At first, many countries believed that it would simply decrease the power of France, but they later tried to concentrate this revolutionary spirit, in fear of the instability being brought to their own countries. This can be seen in Charles Dickens' novel A Tale of Two Cities. Elections for the new assembly brought a passionate liberal body that did not want to leave power in King Louis's hands after his attempt to flee. The majority of these seats were won by men that aligned themselves with a group called the Jacobins. War with Prussia and Austria led to a heightened sense of patriotism and paranoia. On August 10, 1792, people violently attacked the family's palace in Paris. The Legislative Assembly placed the king in prison and suspended all of his duties and privileges, while also calling for a national convention to be elected. In reaction to Louis's imprisonment, many of the clergy and aristocracy were murdered in their prison cells. These September massacres are thought to have been the tangible start of the Second Revolution. That same month of 1792, the National Convention declared France to be a republic. Within the new National Convention were two rival groups, the Girondists and the Mountain, of which was led by a man named Robespierre. After convicting the king of treason and then sentencing him to death by guillotine, the National Convention was determined to continue the war on tyranny it had been fighting with the Prussian monarchy. France would continue to be at war with the majority of Europe until the fall of Napoleon in 1815. After the death of their king, the poor and laboring class began calling for radical action. Pitted in a bitter rivalry, at first both the radical Mountain and more moderate Girondists ignored these demands, and then the Mountain made an alliance. Gaining allies, the two groups ensured the arrest of 31 Girondists, allowing for the Mountain to gain all of the legislative power in the National Convention. After declaring a national emergency, the National Convention created a Committee of Public Safety to be led by Robespierre and other members of the Mountain. This committee would begin the Reign of Terror, the bloodiest portion of the revolution. Within this period, Robespierre would establish a planned economy, controlling the prices of products and introducing the ideas of rations to the French people. The fear of the Girondists was coming true. A dictatorship of the Mountain was ensuing France. While fear ruled the people within France, they were also consumed by a sense of nationalism due to the fact that they were winning their war for ideology throughout Europe. Victory on the front allowed for Robespierre and his members to back down on their control of the French economy, but they expanded their control politically. The Committee of Public Safety imprisoned and executed those that did not agree with them or criticize Robespierre. After the committee killed members of its own coalition, anger at Robespierre ensued. 2 weeks later, while the man tried to address the National Convention, he was brought down and taken to the guillotine the next day. This Thermidorian reaction would try to modernize what the Mountain had done, deciding to erect a failed directory and paving the way for Napoleon Bonaparte to rise as the ruler of France. The French Revolution was a call for liberty and equality by the people. After this period of time, France would not be considered stable for many years. War has a terrible effect on a nation, and an even greater one when fighting is occurring from within. The French Revolution will come to serve as an example of many things throughout history. But the most important is that fighting for freedom is always messy.